The guitar wasn't his. He found it sitting in a house his family had just moved into, unclaimed by whoever had lived there before, and nobody ever came back for it. That abandoned instrument, somewhere in a home on Miles Road in Epsom, Surrey, is where everything about Jimmy Page actually starts. Not on a stage, not in a studio, not with a record deal or a manager or anyone telling him what he could become. Just a 12-year-old boy and a guitar that belongs to nobody, and the kind of private obsession that quietly rewired the history of rock music. Born James Patrick Page on January 9, 1944, in Heston, Middlesex, Jimmy grew up in a family with no particular connection to music. His father worked in industry, and his mother served as a secretary for a doctor's practice, and the household relocated first to Feltham in 1952 before settling in Epsom, where Jimmy attended Pound Lane Primary School and then Ewell County Secondary School in West Ewell at 11. Nothing about those early years suggested the trajectory that was coming. He was the kind of boy who carried the guitar to school every single day, and the teachers had settled into a routine of confiscating it during class and returning it afterward, which suited Jimmy because at least it stayed close enough to touch. A slightly older student named Rod Wyatt gave him his first chords, and from there the education became entirely self-directed and relentless. Blues musicians Elmore James and B.B. King shaped his ear from the start, pulling him toward a rawness that formal lessons couldn't have produced, while Bert Jansch and John Renbourn introduced him to folk music and opened a different technical range. By 1957, at 13, he had joined a skiffle group and appeared on the BBC television show All Your Own, hosted by Hugh Weldon, performing on camera while holding a Hofner President acoustic guitar he'd bought with money saved from summer jobs. When Weldon asked what he planned to do with his life, Jimmy answered that he hoped to work in biological research and help find a cure for cancer. Then at 14, he left school entirely and joined a band called the Crusaders. 2 years of touring with the Crusaders and recording with vocalist Neil Christian followed, including the November 1962 single The Road to Love, before glandular fever caught up with him so badly that continuing wasn't possible. The illness returned every 2 months, and Jimmy later described the touring life of that period as something that was permanently destroying him. He enrolled at Sutton Art College in Surrey, lived on roughly $10 a week while his health rebuilt, and kept playing whenever he could. Performances at the Marquee Club in London placed him on stages alongside Alexis Corner, Eric Clapton, and Jeff Beck, and it was at one of those nights that a man named John Gibb from the Silhouettes spotted him and started offering recording work. The session musician career that followed was rigorous in a way most musicians never experience. By early 1963, Jimmy had already appeared on Diamonds by Jet Harris and Tony Meehan, a record that climbed to #1 on the UK singles chart, and the bookings accelerated from there. Studios distinguished him from another prominent English session guitarist, Big Jim Sullivan, by calling Jimmy Lil Jim P. But the nickname understated what he was actually doing out there. 3 sessions a day, 15 sessions a week, moving between whatever the booking required, sometimes a rock band, sometimes film music, sometimes a folk session, covering all of it without knowing the material in advance. Producer Shel Talmy became a key connection, pulling Jimmy into sessions for The Who and The Kinks. On the Kinks' debut album, he played acoustic 12-string guitar on 2 tracks, and on The Who's first single, I Can't Explain, he handled rhythm guitar while also contributing lead on a separate track. Andrew Loog Oldham, who managed the Rolling Stones, hired him in 1965 to head production and A&R for the newly formed Immediate Records label, giving Jimmy access to sessions with John Mayall, Chris Farlow, and Eric Clapton. A brief songwriting partnership with American singer Jackie DeShannon ran alongside that work, and his playing appeared on Donovan's Sunshine Superman, Engelbert Humperdinck's Release Me, and tracks for Johnny Halliday, Al Stewart, and Joe Cocker. From 1970 onward, Jimmy played lead guitar on 10 Roy Harper tracks, totaling 81 minutes of music, and a 1974 session with Keith Richards produced a track called Scarlet, recorded with Rick Gretsch on bass and Bruce Rowland on drums. Session work ended when brass and orchestral arrangements began pushing guitars to the margins of popular music. The week after he decided to walk away from it, the invitation to join the Yardbirds arrived, which gave the timing a strange quality he couldn't ignore. Back in 1964, when Eric Clapton left the band, Jimmy had been approached but turned it down out of loyalty to Clapton, recommending Jeff Beck as the replacement instead. When both Beck and Jimmy ended up in the Yardbirds simultaneously in 1966, a recording session produced Beck's Bolero, and during those conversations, Keith Moon of The Who floated the name Led Zeppelin, convinced the whole project would go over like a lead balloon. John Entwistle backed the joke enthusiastically, and the name eventually held with a spelling adjustment. Beck left, the remaining Yardbirds fell apart in 1968, and Jimmy had to rebuild a lineup quickly because a Scandinavian tour was already contracted. Robert Plant came in as vocalist, John Bonham on drums, and John Paul Jones on bass and keyboards, and the four completed the tour as the New Yardbirds before manager Peter Grant reshaped the name. Led Zeppelin was built on everything Jimmy had been developing through years of session discipline and Yardbirds improvisation, combining blues, hard rock, and acoustic textures in arrangements that had never been assembled quite that way before. 9 studio albums followed, all of them landing in the Billboard Top 10, with 6 climbing to number 1, and worldwide sales somewhere between 200 and 300 million records, with 111.5 million certified units in the United States, giving them a commercial footprint that very few bands in rock music history have ever matched. The influence on both heavy metal and hard rock was direct and structural, shaped significantly by Jimmy's simultaneous role as producer and lead guitarist on every record. Through the 1970s, he was in a relationship with French model Charlotte Martin, and their daughter Scarlett Page was born in 1971, later building a career in photography. Running parallel to that relationship was a year-long involvement with a young fan named Lori Maddox, which began when she was 14 or 15 and Jimmy was 28. Maddox later described her first encounter with him at the LA Hyatt House as being brought to his suite in a way that felt involuntary, her account carrying a weight the rock culture of the era had conveniently absorbed without scrutiny. The Me Too movement eventually brought it back into public conversation, in a way that held him accountable where the original moment never had. John Bonham died on September 25, 1980, at Jimmy's home in Windsor, Berkshire, after consuming the equivalent of 40 shots of vodka throughout the day. He lost consciousness during the night and never regained it. Led Zeppelin dissolved almost immediately, and Jimmy acknowledged later that picking up the guitar felt genuinely impossible for a period. The grief too deep for anything as ordinary as playing music. Turning 40 in January 1984, an age he'd once privately doubted he would reach, opened what people close to him described as a new phase of thinking about what came next. Projects accumulated without demanding total commitment. A collaborative album with Roy Harper titled Whatever Happened to Juggula came out in 1984, followed by The Honey Drippers Volume 1 with Robert Plant, and then The Firm, a band built around vocalist Paul Rodgers. Their 1985 self-titled debut produced Radioactive and Satisfaction Guaranteed, reached number 17 on the Billboard album chart, and earned gold certification in the United States. Mean Business followed in 1986. The band toured and then broke apart, and during the final American leg of that run, Jimmy walked into a restaurant in New Orleans and met Patricia Ecker, a model working a waitress shift. She traveled to London with him after the tour ended, married him in December 1986, and their son James Patrick Page arrived in April 1988. The marriage held until 1995 without either party ever publicly explaining the split. His solo album, Outrider, also from 1988, featured Robert Plant and John Miles on the opening track Wasting My Time. And that same year, Jimmy rejoined Plant, Jones, and Jason Bonham to close the Atlantic Records' 40th anniversary concert, wrapping up 12 hours of music in the final slot. Live Aid in 1985 had already delivered a partial reunion with Phil Collins and Tony Thompson filling in on drums, and a 1990 concert at Nebworth produced an unannounced plant appearance that caught even those around him off guard. The Coverdale Page album with David Coverdale of Whitesnake arrived in 1993, alongside a brief Japanese tour. And in 1994, Jimmy and Plant recorded an MTV Unplugged special titled Unleaded that drew the network's highest ratings to that point. The mid-1990s. No Quarter Tour led directly into the 1998 studio album Walking into Clarksdale, which produced Grammy Award-winning tracks Most High and Please Read the Letter. That same year, Jimmy recorded the guitar line for Puff Daddy's Come With Me, a track built around the Kashmir riff that appeared on the Godzilla film soundtrack, and the two performed it together on Saturday Night Live. 6 concerts with the Black Crowes in October 1999 produced the live album Live at the Greek, released in 2000 and documenting a set that drew from Led Zeppelin's catalog alongside old blues and rock material. Jamia Gomez Paracha entered the picture during the No Quarter Tour in Brazil, 23 years old when they met while Jimmy was 51. The age difference generated the predictable commentary, but they stayed married for 13 years and raised 2 children together, Sophia Jade and Ashen Josen, before the marriage ended without any public explanation. His long-documented interest in occultism, and specifically in the philosophy of Aleister Crowley, had made him a figure of speculation for decades before that. Jimmy purchased Crowley's former home at Loch Ness in 1971, had Crowley's maxim, "Do what thou wilt," pressed into the run-out groove of a Led Zeppelin album, and collected related artifacts with genuine seriousness. He never confirmed any association with Satanism, stating that his beliefs were personal and not something he wanted to push on to anyone else. The rumor that Stairway to Heaven contained a satanic message when played in reverse eventually reached him, and Robert Plant's reaction was near disbelief, noting that whoever came up with that idea must have had an unusual amount of free time on their hands. Formal recognition arrived consistently. An OBE for charity work in Brazil came in 2004, followed by honorary citizenship of Rio de Janeiro, a Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award with Led Zeppelin, and induction into the UK Music Hall of Fame in November 2006. An honorary doctorate from the University of Surrey at Guildford Cathedral followed in 2008. The same year, Jimmy performed alongside Leona Lewis at the closing ceremony of the Summer Olympics in Beijing. A United Nations Peace Award came in 2010. President Obama presented Jimmy, Robert Plant, and John Paul Jones with a Kennedy Center honor in December 2012, recognizing their contribution to American cultural life through music. Led Zeppelin won a Grammy Award for Best Rock Album for Celebration Day in 2013, and Berklee College of Music in Boston granted Jimmy an honorary doctorate the following year. The December 2007 reunion concert at the O2 Arena in London, with Jason Bonham playing his father's drum parts, set a world record for ticket demand with 20 million requests for a single show. On June 7, 2008, Jimmy and John Paul Jones joined the Foo Fighters at Wembley Stadium and closed the concert with Rock and Roll and Ramble On, a moment that reminded the audience what it sounded like when he played without any restraint at all. In 2014, Jimmy arrived at the back of a London bookshop to hear a poet named Scarlett Sabe give a reading. She was 25 at the time, he was 70, and what started that evening has lasted nearly 9 years. Scarlett described their life at Jimmy's London home, Tower House, as genuinely quiet, full of family visits and ordinary rhythms, far removed from the excess that the rock mythology attached to his name tends to project. She described him as funny, as someone who makes her laugh more than anyone, and said that when they're together, the age difference simply doesn't register between them. He announced plans that same year to form a new band and return to solo touring for the first time since 1988. But the lineup was never confirmed, and the tour never materialized. In April 2024, posts on his social media accounts raised the possibility of an expanded Coverdale Page release that might include unreleased tracks, among them a song called Saccharine. Why that album came back into discussion 30 years after its release remained unclear, particularly since Coverdale had been the one pursuing a box set since 2018, before apparently stepping away from the idea. Whether or not that release arrives, Jimmy Page, at 80, still speaks about music the way someone does when they have more they want to say, still drawn back to the guitar that turned up unclaimed in an empty room when he was 12 years old, still the guitarist that every guitarist eventually studies.